vodka, it's what's for breakfast. It's funny.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 348, and I gotta tell you, I like this Luciferian album, but this music is way too fast for what we're doing this week. That's more like it, because this week we're talking about funeral doom, the genre. And I do consider it to be kind of its own genre, because think about it.
Think about it!
People like to use the word doom metal a lot, and it does have some meaning, but usually it's really more of an adjective than a proper genre concept. Like when you hear a band such as Minotauri being described as doom metal, it's really more just like heavy metal being played at a more doomy pace. Similarly, you hear a band like Asphyx being described as doom metal. In this case, it's death metal being played with more of a sense of weight at, again, a much more doom-laden sort of pace. Then you get a band like Candlemass described as epic doom metal, and it ends up sounding not so much like a separate genre unto itself, but more like power metal being played at a doomier pace with a gloomier sort of atmosphere. Funeral doom, however, out of all the sub-styles of metal that carry the doom metal label, is the one that can most claim to be a style unto itself. It's separated stylistically from the other broader types of metal to the point where it becomes its own thing. In fact, I would say funeral doom is one of the youngest new genres of metal to come out, albeit it's still about 30 years old at this point. In terms of being its own genre of music, that's still pretty young in age. Funeral doom is kind of interesting in that it kind of arose organically from different places all over the world when we're talking about bands that were both proto-funeral doom and early funeral doom proper. I mean, you got the band Winter from New York. Go a little bit farther south into New Jersey, you get Evoken and Hierophant. Across the sea in England, you have Esoteric coming up around the same time. Then farther into the European continent, you got Mordor coming out of Switzerland. You got the band Funeral themselves coming out of Norway. Over in Finland, you've got Unholy. Farther east into Russia, you've got Russkaya Zima, which if you're unfamiliar with them, I would recommend watching RFI episode 253, because they're a pretty great band. Even farther east, Japan, you got Corrupted. And then way out down south, you have one of the most important historical bands for the funeral doom genre, that being Disembowelment from Australia.
Hey guys, I've just got to bloody say, I mean, it's a bloody day for it, isn't it, you know? Where would you rather bloody be? Wow, look at that. Now, that is one, or maybe 100 intelligent bloody spiders. Don't know how they've got down there, but they're catching dragonflies.
Definitely have to do something on those guys someday. But funeral doom, it arose organically from all over the place as a distinct sub-style. But if you were to somehow force a country of origin onto funeral doom, or at least the country that you could most associate with funeral doom, it's gotta be Finland! They've got by far the most funeral doom bands of note of any country, including the aforementioned Unholy, Shape of Despair, Tyranny. Later sub-style of torture doom was pretty much invented there by the band Wormphlegm. But more importantly than that, what I would consider to be the two most important funeral doom albums of all time as far as the genesis of that genre goes are from Finland. And it is those two albums that we are going to be covering this week. We're talking about the debut full-length albums from Thergothon and Skepticism. Of these two bands, Thergothon is about a year older, so we'll start with them. Thergothon is probably the first band you could describe as playing funeral doom, as we know the genre in its modern form today, compared to other bands like Disembowelment or Winter that were funeral doom-esque, but not just straight up pure funeral doom. Thergothon's fucking funeral doom. I mean, for fuck's sake, Evoken from New Jersey themselves are named after a Thergothon song. They only existed for like 3 years, and they put out a real small amount amount of material. The main two things worth noting are the Patagon Nog Yog Sothoth demo from 1991 and their post-split-up full-length Stream from the Heavens. The second of which I would consider to be the more important release, and I know there's a lot of people that are really into that 91 demo, but
Okay, here's the thing, YouTube.
the demo is a lot closer to being, just doomy death metal than the album is. This is particularly noticeable on songs that appear on both releases, like Elemental. Yeah, it's definitely slower and spacier than your average death metal band, but it still generally kind of sounds like a more developed form of the doomy sort of death metal you might hear from a band like My Dying Bride or Anathema, particularly during the harmonized sections like this one right here. When you get to the album version of that song, this is something else entirely. For one, yeah, it's a lot slower, but there's also a much more noticeable concentration on negative space with those guitar riffs kind of letting the waves of reverb bounce into each other. And the drum technique is completely divorced from anything you're going to hear in a death metal band. In fact, it's a lot closer to how percussion would work in an orchestral setting, which would become something of a hallmark for funeral doom in general, to the point where a later band like Skepticism, the drummer would say, "I want it to sound like my drum beat should be played with mallets rather than drumsticks." I don't hear a lot of talk about the drumming in funeral doom, but for me that's one of the most important elements that separates it from any other style of metal, that really orchestral feel. In fact, it's not just the drums that have that orchestral feel to it. Pretty much everything going on with Thergothon feels like different instrumental sections in an orchestra interacting with each other. The different guitar lines feel like different sections of violins. The keyboards exist almost as this organic pedal drone note, and then those drums. Just watch this transition section right here into the vocals. That is textbook archetypal funeral doom drumming, and it doesn't sound like anything you're going to hear in any other subgenre of heavy metal, which is something you could apply to pretty much all of this album. Even compared to other funeral doom bands, this shit is alienated and strange. The different overlapping vocal styles, that absolutely gonzo reverbed guitar, where it feels like waves of sound bouncing around inside an immersion tank. Definitely not an album that a lot of people are going to enjoy on first listen, but I promise you, if you give this a chance and really soak in the vibe it's putting forth, this is one of the best doom metal albums ever. If you couldn't tell from the name of their demo, these guys were big on H.P. Lovecraft. They come to it from a very particular place. Not the sort of memey Lovecraft they got going on nowadays, like, "Hey guys, did you hear what his cat's named?"
Boo! Fucking nigga.
No, we're talking about Lovecraft before the internet got to it. A profound sense of what one might call existential despair, but also sort of an emotional emptiness. I've heard this album called depressive before. I don't quite agree. I feel like depression is way too human of a concept to be applied to what is purposefully inhuman sounding music, because it's trying to mimic that Lovecraft vibe. Not necessarily Cthulhu, thinking more the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the dream cycle stories, the real weird psychedelic ones. I mentioned those drums earlier and how they work in a very orchestral manner. Part of that is they know when not to use them at all, because one of the things that really separates orchestral music from like a standard, metal band type of music is there's defined parts where entire sections of the ensemble don't play at all. Like if you listen to a Bruckner symphony or a Mahler symphony, there are elements of percussion. Occasionally they are going to whack some cymbals or hit something with a big wooden hammer, but at the same time there's parts where that shit just goes away. That sort of thinking, very much an important part of funeral doom. You got this song at the midpoint of the album entitled The Unknown Kadath and the Cold Waste. Again, a very obvious reference to H.P. Lovecraft's dream cycle stories. When it starts out, there's no drums at all. It's mostly just that guitar line and these weird, schizophrenic sounding whispers with a bit of a keyboard drone in the background. It cycles through this ultra simplistic doom metal riff a couple times before even that goes away. The distorted guitars drop out, and then we get a reintroduction of percussive elements, but not standard metal percussion at all. Instead, it's a whole lot of brushes and triangles, with the primary percussive weight coming from every time he scrapes his pick over those acoustic guitar strings. If you haven't figured it out by now, this is a genre that's huge on texture, more so than pretty much any other style of metal music. From a certain point of view, it's the most developed form of extreme metal in that regard. Then the drums finally come back in, And they're given much more weight because they re-emerged after that absence of drums from the album. That's what I mean when I say this band thinks very orchestrally and not a standard sort of heavy metal band thought process at all, which is probably why a lot of people, you put on some Funeral Doom for them, they just straight up get bored and fall asleep. They don't really get it. If you listen to this with the standard metal mindset, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. You really have to kind of open your mind up to what Funeral Doom's putting forward, because it is a very different way of looking at extreme metal music. But to my ears, at least when it's done well, this stuff is incredibly engaging. And it's probably the heaviest form of metal music, again, from a certain point of view. You know, it's not incredibly brutal or punishing, but it has this sense of scope that isn't really hinted at by any other form of metal outside of some of the better ambient black metal acts. That's also another part of why I think Funeral Doom really is its own special subgenre. Because yeah, it came out of doom death, I guess, but it's got just as much in common with a lot of black metal stuff, and it's got this incorporation of external elements from ambient music and classical music that are incorporated in a way that isn't really done by other genres of metal. Yeah, there's symphonic black metal, but see right there, that transition, that had way more to do with romantic classical music than pretty much anything that's ever come out of the symphonic black metal genre. Funeral Doom isn't orchestral in its aesthetics, you know, the sonic qualities of the music. Rather, it's orchestral in how the songs themselves are put together. It's certainly very emotive music, but it's not a typical sort of human maudlin emotion that you generally associate with something that's labeled as depressive. Like right here, all the lyrics are being sung from the perspective of a cultist of one of these elder Lovecraft deities. So there is some existential despair, but there's also like a perverted sense of worship to everything. It's hard to describe in words, but it ekes out through the music itself. In a way, it's one of the most intensely spiritual forms of heavy metal music. It's not really depressive or suicidal in a way that a lot of this kind of music is assumed to be. I mean, there certainly are other Funeral Doom bands that go into that territory, notably stuff like Esoteric.
I have a hard time every day, and sometimes I want to die.
But for me, what makes Thergothon special is it's just got its own weird feeling to it that I haven't really heard replicated anywhere else. The closest any other band comes to touching that kind of feeling would be Skepticism, who's the band we're going to cover next. Thergothon, they made their one statement, they broke up, everybody went off to do like shoegaze and dance music or whatever. Skepticism stuck around, like they're still going today. I'll probably have to do an episode on their later work at some point in the future, because not only have they been prolific, but they've maintained a pretty exceptional level of quality over their long career. But for me, their first album, Stormcrow Fleet, is still their best. It uses Thergothon as kind of a jumping off point to something even more separate from normal extreme metal music. As soon as you put this album on, it becomes immediately apparent that the drum technique is even further removed from standard extreme metal sort of drum work, particularly in the way the guy uses his cymbals, very orchestral in nature. But even more so than that, you're hit with the emotion this album puts forth. Despite the fact these guys have all the funeral accoutrement, you know, the suits, the coffins, the flowers on stage, they aren't really depressive at all. It's definitely more just kind of mystical and sort of solemn, very serious music. That, more than anything else, is probably the best way to describe Funeral Doom. As you're hearing right now, these guys very much pick up where Thergothon left off with their usage of negative space, in this case pulling out every instrumental element except for the keyboards, then subtly bringing the percussion back in, before then reintroducing the guitars, which kind of perform this rising drone action over the top of the lead melody here, which is still being played in cyclical fashion by those keyboards. If you're looking for Cannibal Corpse or Suffocation, you're probably not going to dig this, but if you take it on its own terms, I think this is pretty harrowing music. And this drum part coming up right here, I still don't think anybody's ever topped it. Like the way this guy uses cymbals, and the thing he's doing here with the snare drum where he's mimicking the melodic motion of the prior keyboard part in an entirely percussive context, as well as this build up to the reintroduction of the guitars. That's impressive stuff, and it's incredibly heavy. Again, not heavy in the same way that a death metal band or even a black metal band is heavy, or even in the way that a more heavy metal sort of doom metal band is heavy, but heavy nonetheless. speaking of black metal, Skepticism, these guys have a lot of ties to that genre, even more so than they have ties to death metal. Everybody in this band has also been in an old school Finnish black metal band called Thromdar for about as long as Skepticism has existed. But even in the context of Skepticism themselves, they have some very black metal sounding songs. Like this bit right here, one of my favorite songs on this album, The Rising of the Flames. Its main intro guitar riff very much sounds like a Funeral Doom take on the sort of jaunty thing you might hear from Satanic War Master or even Absurd. Then the drums kick in, and yeah, it goes back to more standard Funeral Doom stuff, but it's still got that Graveland-esque bounce to the guitar riff that's given a whole new dimension of emotion when played in a more Funeral Doom style. And speaking of black metal adjacent type stuff, really nice keyboard work on this album. Definitely should appeal to fans of Dungeon Synth. Then we had back into more of that black metal Funeral Doom kind of thing. For me, not depressive at all. I'm not going to say it's happy, but it seems more like it's just sort of content to exist. It's like the natural world itself gaining sentience to express itself.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
Yeah. Maybe that's a little bit pretentious, but this is the kind of stuff you think about when you listen to Funeral Doom. This is the headspace it puts you in. Right here, we've kind of left that jauntier feeling behind in favor of what almost seems like a reinterpretation of the riffing style Bathory had on the Hammerheart albums, again in a much more Funeral Doom-centric context. Maybe it's like Falkenbach's slower moving but more thoughtful older brother in that regard. And speaking of that, quite a lot of this album reminds me of Summoning. And I'm not talking Minas Morgul's Summoning. I'm talking like Oathbound era Summoning with the orchestral percussion, the dense usage of keyboards and very thick guitar riffs, and just the overall quality of the melodies themselves. There's this mystical, shamanic, almost tribal thing they got going on, particularly during the fast parts.
분기반장을 잘 할 수 있어.
This counts as a fast part for Skepticism. Alright, it's fucking Funeral Doom. This is practically 1349 for them. Then it rolls into a more minimalist section. Probably the point on the album at which they get the closest to sounding like Thergothon, with this very minimalist drumming and guitar drones just kind of emanating out from the snare hits. Keyboard's also kind of doing a drone thing. But then it heads into this super majestic sounding part. This is where I say it sounds like Summoning. It really gives off that same sort of medieval, decayed, majestic sort of vibe. And the drumming here is just phenomenal with the way it locks into the melodic pulse of this music. Almost kind of has like a militaristic marching feel to it. Although again, it's very slow. From there, we pull away the keyboard layers in favor of a more guitar-centric approach for the song's coda. Again, utilizing that orchestral approach of removing and adding back in and removing again of different instrumental layers. Speaking of codas, that's a pretty effective coda for this episode. As I mentioned earlier, I'm probably going to do more with Skepticism someday, just because they got a lot of really good albums. But if you've got any interest in Funeral Doom at all, you really need to get the first Thergothon and the first Skepticism albums. That'll give you a better idea than pretty much anything else about what goes on inside Funeral Doom, the kind of thing you can expect from the genre when it's done properly. Because let me let you in on a dirty little secret. A lot of Funeral Doom fucking sucks, especially when it comes to bands that started after Funeral Doom became a codified genre. I mean, you could say that for almost any genre of music. Norwegian black metal was a lot better before there was a standard Norwegian black metal template that existed for other bands to copy. Same with Swedish death metal. Hell, even the same with a lot of the New York death metal stuff. Generally, the originators are going to be the best. And that definitely holds true for Funeral Doom, so get yourself a copy of Thergothon's Stream from the Heavens and Skepticism Stormcrow Fleet if you haven't already. Thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.